Okay, thank you, Nikki. And once again, so like officially a welcome to everybody who's joined us. So safeguarding considerations for coaches and mentors. Really what I wanted to do without spending too much time on it is really just outline like how we got to this webinar that my friend and colleague Nikki has kindly volunteered to run the majority of. Through a number of different webinars that we've had in our monthly get-together, the issue of safeguarding came up. And one of the things that we tend to think about around safeguarding is that it's predominantly within the school environment. And safeguarding is a lot broader than that. And as a result of that conversation, and as a result of thinking about all of the different iterations that safeguarding might create and the need for coaches and mentors to be aware of that, we decided through a combination of cajoling and volunteering that it would be useful to run a session like this on safeguarding and just start to raise some of the considerations for coaches and mentors. So as Nikki pointed out, it's not a training session as such, it's more about information, and we would certainly welcome not just your questions, but any experiences that you've got, or any ideas you've got, or anything that you've come across yourself that would be beneficial for the other people who are part of this call, and also for ourselves. From an accreditation point of view, one of the things that we may be considering is adding aspects to it which essentially fall into the category of, if you work within an environment whereby you are likely to coach or mentor or work with people who might fall within the vulnerability area or the safeguarding category, then we're going to start to strongly recommend that certain things have taken place, and that might include policies and procedures in training, but we'll come on to that as we go through it. So conscious of the fact that people are probably interested in Nikki's content rather than me talking about Nikki's content, let me pass you over to Nikki. If you do have any questions or queries, as Nikki mentioned, if you put them into the chat box or save them to the end, then we will work our way around to addressing them. We are aiming at finishing at 4 o'clock. So we will aim to honour that. So if anything goes on beyond that, we will either pick it up and respond to you by email or any other means, or if it requires more of a one-to-one intervention, then we will do that as well. So over to you then, Nikki.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you for joining us for this session. It's a subject that's quite close to my heart, and the reason that we've put this session together is because I underwent some safeguarding training a couple of years ago as part of some work I was doing with another organisation, and it was during that training that the cogs were whirring in my head, and I was going, you know what, a big chunk of this is relevant to my coaching mentoring work. And so just bear with me while if I could ask you all to just check that you're all muted in the background, that would be fabulous. So as I say, this is the training that I was doing, thinking about how much of this is relevant to our coaching and mentoring work. So this session is to raise your awareness, get you thinking about which considerations you might need for the work that you're doing. So we've got a whole range of coaches and mentors with all sorts of different niches. So some of this will be more relevant than others, but as we go through, you'll see that there may be considerations that are applicable across the board. So some of the things that we're just going to touch on, have a think about, is what do we mean by safeguarding? What are those considerations? What might you want to consider from the perspective of you as the coach or mentor? And what might you need to consider with respect to safeguarding and clients? And so thinking about safeguarding, what are the principles of safeguarding? We talk about providing a safe environment and culture. Now, a lot of us as coaches or mentors, we might talk about holding a safe space for the client, which might, in traditional terms, we might mean confidential, or somewhere which feels emotionally safe for the client to be vulnerable. We might, in terms of safeguarding, the broader aspect of that is a physically safe environment as well. So we'll come back to that in a little while. Thinking about how, as part of safeguarding principles, the requirement to respond promptly to any safeguarding concerns or allegations that might be raised, acting professionally to those who might be a subject of any concerns or allegations, and responding to those that might pose a risk to themselves or to others. So it's that kind of context is what we mean when we're thinking about safeguarding. David mentioned that when we think about safeguarding, traditionally, most of us probably think about safeguarding children and the rules and regulations. Certainly here in the UK, we've got the Child Care Act, which is designed to specifically protect children. We also have vulnerable adults, and there are specific categories within safeguarding where we're talking about vulnerable adults. And the content I'm going to talk about today is in respect of the adult space. There are specific separate rules for children. And I would encourage any of you working in the child environment, so if you're coaching children, coaching families where children are involved in schools and education, I would encourage you to think about what safeguarding requirements there are working with young people. For today, I'm going to talk about vulnerable adults, vulnerable people in the adult space. And this is one of the sort of definitions that's come from the Social Care Institute of Excellence. And they said adults with safeguarding needs, so a vulnerable adult, an adult with safeguarding needs is a term covering a wide range of people, from those with learning disabilities through to those experiencing dementia, and may also include adults whose mental capacity fluctuates, such as those with mental health or substance misuse difficulties. And so those areas are probably things, if I'd ask you to list who would you describe as a vulnerable person, those are probably the sorts of categories that you might traditionally think of. And if you think about who do you work with, which niches do you operate in, who might you work with that might fall into one of those categories? And some niches are more obvious than others. So if you worked with, for example, say you coached people who are recovering from substance addiction, if you're working in that space, then your coaching would definitely obviously fall into working with clients in this category. But one of the things that was a bit of a sort of revelation to me when I was doing my safeguarding training was actually the definition of vulnerable adult, or the circumstances that can cause a person to be vulnerable, is much, 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 much broader than this. And somebody might be a vulnerable person at different times in their life. So somebody might be absolutely fine, not categorized in the vulnerable category for most of the time, but their circumstances might change, which might cause them either to shift into the vulnerable category from now on, or just temporarily to be classed in that vulnerable category. So here's a list of some of those categories, some of those factors which might result in one of our clients being in this vulnerable space. So if we're working with adults who are much older, then just by dint of their requirements in their older age, that might cause them to be vulnerable. Some of these are really obvious. We might think about the needs of somebody if they've got physical or mental disabilities, physical or mental illness. Somebody in hospital has different needs to somebody who's able-bodied at home. Thinking about if we're working with clients who have perhaps learning difficulties of some sort, dependency on substances or alcohol. If somebody's been a victim of various sorts of abuses, then that might put them in the vulnerable category. So some of these things you might think are quite obvious vulnerabilities. What we probably don't think of are some of the ones that are more, shall I say, mainstream. So bereavement. Bereavement is going to happen pretty much to, I would argue, probably most of the clients we work with at some point, we will work with somebody who's handling bereavement. And if you think about the definition of being a vulnerable adult, can be that their emotional state has shifted. So if we're handling bereavement, our emotional state can shift quite significantly. And whilst we might think we're doing fine, those around us might look at us and go, you know what, I don't think you're fine after all. Relationship breakdown. I know a couple of coaches who specialise in coaching through and post divorce, and that's their niche. So the emotional impact of relationship transitions, moving from single from in a relationship to being single, the emotional roller coaster that goes with that can result in somebody being more vulnerable. Change in employment, redundancy. Currently, with all the impact of the COVID-19 impact on businesses that we're seeing at the time of recording today, redundancy is something that is being talked about quite a lot at the moment. So we may well come across clients who have been employed and are now facing unemployment or redundancy or temporary changes in their position. Being in prison, homelessness. I did some work last year, and I've still got contacts with a homelessness charity, and the group coaching that I ran for their charity, the people they're supporting. That was definitely a vulnerable group of adults. So I was very mindful of my responsibilities caring for that group. And then we're in some of the other areas which maybe we don't quite come across maybe in our mainstream coaching mentoring, but just to be aware of is refugees, asylum seekers, survivors or victims of past abuses, sexual exploitation, and victims of harassment and or bullying. So when you look at that checklist, if you took that as a tick list, when you think about the clients you have worked with, how many of your clients would you put in some of those categories? I can definitely bring to mind 2 or 3 clients in the not too distant past who have handled bereavements. One client, multiple bereavements over the course of a few months. And we'll come back to the subject of harassment or bullying in a little while. David, was there, I know we were talking about, particularly with respect to bereavement, is there something you wanted to mention on this thing where we're getting people to think about who of their clients might fall into this vulnerable person category at some point?
Yeah, I think it's a valid point that you make, Nikki, that a lot of the sort of the things that are on this list, so like some of them might be sort of blatantly obvious, but you don't know what happens with a client between one session and the next, because you're not with them so like 24/7. And it's very easy to be in the middle of a coaching engagement or a mentoring engagement and something happens that you're not aware of, and people will respond to that in different ways depending upon circumstances, depending upon how long the issue's been going on, whether they're prepared for it, personality style, and a whole host of other things. And yeah, just as an example, and not necessarily so like a coaching mentoring example, but I meet a lot of people so like dog walking, and in the past 3 weeks I've met 3 people who have all lost so like partners and spouses over the past so like 3 weeks, and have just come up and like in mid conversation I've simply said, oh, did I tell you that I lost my husband? Did I tell you that like, my wife died? And you're in that position of going, no, because really all I did was I wanted to come out and like walk the dogs and have those sort of conversations. And it raises the issue that you can do as much so like training, so like coaching and mentoring wise as you wish, and follow any type of model. But in reality, so like once you've asked that initial, like, what would you like to talk about question, you're like how are things going for you? At the moment question, you really have to be prepared for any of this to like to come out. It could be bereavement, it could be a relationship breakdown, it could be, oh, I've just been made unemployed, it could be like I've just been made redundant, and we're sort of torn between and I'm sure sort of we'll come on to it sort of like as we go through sort of like the content, but we need to be mindful of not labeling people vulnerable because they fall into a box and just going with it that clearly they're a vulnerable person. Because some people might turn around and go, well, like I'm a little bit offended by the fact that you consider me to be vulnerable, and I now feel vulnerable because you think I'm vulnerable. So we need to take into consideration like what's going on for that person. And I think so like the other thing within that as well is that people will deal with these things in completely different ways. It's a sort of big V, small v. Some people will be very vulnerable, and some people won't. And in between that, you have the people who are clearly vulnerable. They just don't recognize it or acknowledge it or deal with it in an authentic way. So there are just things that we need to be aware of. And also, and something else I'd like to for you to think about is, if you were dealing with a client who had any of these issues, what sense of vulnerability does that pull up for yourself? So for example, if you were dealing with somebody with a physical illness that you had either recently dealt with yourself or you have your own experience of, the likelihood is that that's going to tap into your own vulnerability about that. And therefore, you know, what happens then between like transference and counter-transference and all of those sorts of things. So it's just like an additional list of things to be aware of. And as Nikki was saying, so like I'll come back to some of my own actual examples, so like around the harassment and bullying piece and the sort of sexual exploitation piece, so like a little bit later.
Thanks, David. So that's a good point, that while we're talking about this in using the term vulnerable adult and so on, that we're using this from the point of view of what do I want to keep in the back of my mind, as opposed to telling the client I have given them a particular label or category. So yeah, good point, thank you. So picking up on that then, thinking about which of your clients might be vulnerable, and if you want to pick up and share some of these exercise answers at the end after we've stopped recording the content, then you can share what comes to mind as well. Thinking about which of your clients might be in that vulnerable category, in inverted commas, what considerations do you want to make a note of now? So just bearing in mind that, what do you want to make a note of for yourself now, either to follow up later on or to be aware of when you're working with your clients? And I mentioned that we talk about holding a safe space for clients, whatever that means for you. When we talk about creating a safe space, sometimes if a client hears the word safe space, it might be that for the first time ever they feel safe to mention something that they've been keeping to themselves. So what do you do, or what will you do, if something is disclosed to you during a session? We'll come back to contracting and setting up expectations and so on in a little while. When you've set up that relationship with the client, the client who's coming to you for a one, very often in my experience this comes up in one-to-one rather than group sessions, although I have had somebody disclose something in a group coaching session which needed a whole host of extra careful handling in that space. Very often in my experience it's much more likely to come up in a one-to-one session where it's just you and you've created this nice safe space of rapport and the client feels able to open up about things and they disclose something. My hope for you is that you as the coach or mentor will have a plan in mind that says, if somebody discloses something, this is what I will do at that point, so that you're prepared if something unexpected is disclosed, or the client shares something that's happened to them. And it might be something recent, it might be something in their history that's just been triggered or reminded. So I've put an example on here of something that comes up more often. It's probably one of the more common disclosure type things, particularly in a sort of business or executive coaching space. This is an example that happened to me a couple of years ago in a client. It was a one-to-one executive coaching session with a manager who had been referred by the business owner for some coaching to support them in their development. And in the course of that one-to-one, the manager disclosed that he was being, in his words, he was being bullied by a director to whom he reported. So it was his direct report director, and he felt bullied. So my question for you is, if you're in that situation, you're in a one-to-one with a manager and they tell you, I'm being bullied by my director, what would you do next? So it's a little bit of a hypothetical. How would you handle that? So before you jump in with an answer, some things to remember. If something is disclosed to us or revealed during a client session, and these are some bullets that I've lifted out of the safeguarding training that I did, just as reminders, because I found them really useful reminders for myself. It is not your role as coach or mentor to investigate the allegations. So if somebody's disclosed something, it's not our role to investigate. We are not there to ask leading questions or probe for more details or prompt them to try and establish who's to blame, or basically we're not there to dig to find out anything about it. I'm hoping that as professional mentors and coaches, you are already good at holding a space, asking open questions, having no judgment, not probing and digging, because as coaches and mentors, we're trained not to do this anyway, but it's a good reminder list. Don't rush the person. So it might be that if they've disclosed something, particularly if it's something that they've been bottling up for a while, we might just need to give them the space to decide for themselves, oh, I've got that off my chest, I've never said that out loud before. They might need some processing time for themselves. So we don't want to rush them. And we're certainly not going to sit in judgment about whether or not we believe the allegation or the revelation. We're not there to make any judgment one way or another. The thing that's probably most important from coaching and mentoring perspective is do not promise complete confidentiality, even if it's asked, because the client might disclose something which we have an obligation to report. So when we come back to talking about contracts and agreements, or coaching or mentoring contracts or agreements a little bit later, in your confidentiality clause, how have you phrased that so that if the situation occurs where it is necessary for you to mention something to another party, that there are times where the confidentiality doesn't apply. So there are times where even if somebody says, look, I know this is all one-to-one, it's all confidential and stays in these four walls, it's important that we don't promise confidentiality that we can't then either we're forced to break that promise, or we're forced to break an obligation elsewhere. And never assume that someone else will recognise and report what we have seen or heard. So if something's disclosed to us, if we think, well, okay, well, that was just something they've passed, I'll let that slide, somebody else will be handling that. It might be appropriate for us to be that trusted person. We might need to have to come out of coach mode or out of mentor mode and just be there as a responsible grown-up and think, okay, what do I need to do as a result of this disclosure? So I've put on the end of there, decide what your particular course of action will be if something is disclosed to you during a session. So you will know the type of coaching or mentoring you do. You'll know the sort of scenarios in which you're working. So taking my example there of, it was business coaching arrangement. I'd been asked to do some one-to-one executive coaching development work in that scenario. So in that environment, what would be the appropriate thing to do? So in my case, I went and spoke to the head of HR and the owner of the business, because I felt that this was a piece of information that needed addressing through their proper channels in the organisation that they had set up. I've come across bullying allegations in the past in other scenarios, so I already knew that if this comes up again, this will be my course of action. I did explain to the person who disclosed it, I thanked them for feeling able to share what they had shared, and I did say to them, I am going to have to mention this to somebody else, because the seriousness of what you have disclosed to me means that from an ethical point of view, I cannot sit on this information. So I let them know what my course of action was going to be, and they were okay with that. And I think they did say that they were quite relieved that somebody else knew about it and somebody was going to do something about it. David, I know you've got another example from the bullying side of things. Do you want to mention that?
Yeah, sure. It was something that came up in a supervision session that I was running. And in this instance, the coach was working with the client again inside an organization, and the coach's client identified that there had been some sexual harassment. And they also identified what they were planning to do about it. And the issues that came out of that were actually quite numerous. First and foremost, the coach was unsure what action to take. And part of the reason for that, or if not the main reason, was that during the contracting within the organization, normally when we talk about contracting, we talk about the contract between the coach and the client. But within organizations, we often have a 3 or even a 4-way contract, if not more in some cases. And a 3-way contract is essentially the relationship that you have between yourself as a coach or mentor and the client, but also the relationship that you have with an organization. Some organisations will quite happily say, whatever you talk about with the client is confidential, we don't need to know, just get on and do it. Some will be a little bit more flexible around that in terms of, yes, we would like to know, but we will get that information direct from the person that you're coaching. So we'll have our own separate meeting. And some will want to know everything, and that might bring all three of you together. In this instance, because no contracting had taken place, so like within the three-way aspect of it, the coach didn't have so like an escape route. They couldn't go to the organisation because nothing had been discussed. So therefore, so like had they done that, they would have known about policies and procedures. They would have known about who they can take it to. And one of the things that came out of the supervision session was the need for the coach to sort of draw a line and go, you know what, I need to go and speak to the organisation and ask them the question, what if? So in all of my engagements, what if something comes out that is clearly a breach of your policy and procedure? So anything around equal opportunities, bullying, harassment, etc., etc., etc. And knowing who the go-to person is for anything like that. But as Nikki has gone through, the deciding what your course of action is going to be is something that's better if it's pre-prepared in terms of I've done my contracting, I know what will happen in these situations. As it was, the coach was also concerned about what the client was planning on doing in order of dealing with this. And another thing that came out of it was that this wasn't the first experience. There were other people who had had like issues with the person in question. So it was ultimately decided at a later session that yes, it would be reported within the organisation, and it was ultimately all sorted out. But it's one of those things that the contracting, and I know sort of like for those of you who come to like a number of the sessions when I'm talking about anything, contracting is much more important than a lot of people put credibility to. It's your opportunity to really get into the core of, right, this is the nice, warm and fluffy bit, and if everything goes according to plan, it's going to be this. But if something goes down Tangent Boulevard or takes a swift turn down Distraction Drive, then we need to have a mechanism of dealing with it, and this is what it is. And certainly within the the curiosity state of coaching and mentoring, and we're all taught through training courses, oh, be curious, really probe into things. If something comes up as a disclosure, it's one of those times where you really need to question yourself and go, right, I need to just hold back my curiosity here, because there might be a lot of things that I'm curious about that bear no resemblance to how I'm going to help this individual. And as Nikki said right at the beginning, it's not my role to investigate. It's not my role to really dig into this out of my own natural curiosity. It's my role to help that person take the best course of action, and also know what course of action that I'm going to take as well. And certainly the ability to actually say to people openly and honestly, look, this is what the course of action is going to be, this is what I'm going to do, so that everybody knows what's going to happen, then it's sort of dealt with. The other bit that falls out of that as well is that just because you go to somebody else doesn't mean that it's going to have the outcome that the client wants. What it means is that you have followed through on what you said you were going to do in the way that you said you were going to do it, and that at least then something is happening. So the sort of the moral of the tale is that contracting is really important, and the openness and honesty about what is confidential, what's not confidential, and also maybe touch on that again, is equally really important.
Lovely, thank you very much. Which brings us beautifully into some of the practicalities to keep a consideration of. So the second one down there, you'll see thinking about your contracts or agreements, for whether it's your coaching agreement, coaching contract, mentoring agreements, contracts. As I mentioned before, think about how have you worded clauses like confidentiality. What considerations might you want to make sure are covered there? If you've got a 3 or a 4-way or 5-way contract, what have you put in there about what you will and will not share as a matter of routine anyway? Because very often the management need feedback of what's happened in a session, but also specifically protecting yourself and your client so that you've covered it. But also it means that you've got something to refer to. As David said, if things don't go to plan, you've got something that's yours. So you remember we said in the agreement, this is what will happen. It's much easier if you've got something to refer back to as your sort of touch point to say this is what we're going to do. I've mentioned there up top record keeping. So we a lot of us are, under the terms of our insurance, are required to keep records or details of or notes of sessions. So how much or how little sensitive information are you recording in your record keeping of your sessions? How much information, how much detail? If it is a serious matter and you believe you might be called on later on, depending on what it is that's been disclosed. So for example, if there was a tribunal as a result and you were called on to give evidence, for example, at that tribunal, might you need to make some notes while things are fresh in your mind so that you've got those notes to refer back to further down the line if something comes up in a few months' time. So if something significant is disclosed, how are you going to record that? Alongside that, we've got the data protection requirements under GDPR, and whatever you've captured in your privacy notice alongside that, to say this is the information that I capture in sessions. This is the information I hold, this is how I use it, this is how I store it. So if you are going to keep detailed records of sessions, make sure that your privacy notice is consistent with the information that you're capturing. And if you do need to record additional information that's outside of that notice, make sure that you have got the client's permission to keep that information, to store that sensitive information about the client. Boundaries and expectations. So what we do and don't do. That I put that in there partly around what David was saying about contracts and the importance of people understanding what the different sort of communication channels there are. The other thing is making sure, and sometimes we need to remind clients partway down the line, what the boundaries are for coaching or what the boundaries are for mentoring. I even have to remind clients the differences between the two. If I'm in as a coach and they know I also mentor, sometimes you need to remind them which hat am I wearing. But this is a broader thing about what we do and don't do as coaches and mentors compared with therapy, counselling, other support interventions that might be available. And making sure that if it does seem like a bit of a therapy session or the client just wants to talk. I have had a client who said, you know what, I don't want coaching today, I just want to talk to somebody, I just need a listening ear. So we need to respect those boundaries and expectations and check in with the client in that situation. So are you okay that you are not having a coaching session today? I would basically take my coach hat off, and yeah, by all means you can sit and use me just as a sounding board or just as a listening ear, but this is not one of your coaching sessions if you're going to do that. So we are there to hold and respect those boundaries and maintain those boundaries as professionals. So make sure that your clients understand that and make sure that you're clear where your boundaries are. And then I've put in there, have a mechanism to pause the coaching or mentoring if necessary. And what I mean by mechanism is, if something is disclosed to you during a session, and that question I asked you before about what will you do if that happens, what mechanism are you putting in place? And this may be part of your coaching agreement or mentoring contract, so that if something arises where it becomes clear that coaching or mentoring is not appropriate for that client at that time, what do you have a mechanism to pause? So if you're in the middle of a series of coaching sessions, and something's disclosed and it's appropriate that the client has a break to resolve whatever the thing is that's come up. It might be that you put a pause on the sessions for a month and they come back to them later. It might be that you've got something where you will carry on working with them, but in a different way. I did some work a while ago with a client who was seeing a clinical hypnotherapist as well as having the coaching. and they set up a three-way setup where the client gave me permission to talk to their therapist, their hypnotherapist, and he spoke to me, and we both spoke to the client, and the client was responsible for setting up that three-way talk. And I was very mindful up front to say, you know what, if there is something that's coming up through the other therapy that says the coaching is not appropriate, I will pause the coaching and pick up again later. For that one, as it happened, we ran concurrently. She saw us alternate weeks, and it was very effective. But it might have been, depending on how it was for that client, what the alternative was, that I paused the coaching, they have their work with their hypnotherapist, and then they come back for the coaching later. So just be mindful of what is your mechanism for pausing. Taking the comments that David and I both made earlier about bereavement. If a client has lost a close family member in between two sessions, when they come back for their next coaching or mentoring meeting, they might say, oh no, I'm fine, I'd love the distraction, and you're talking to them and it's really clear that they are anything but fine. And whilst they might be looking for a distraction or something to take their mind off what's happened, you know they're not going to get the best value out of the coaching or mentoring, or you might go through the motions of the session but they're really not getting what they need from it. So it might be appropriate that you pause and say, you know what, I'll honour the appointment and we'll just pause the programme that we're on. Let's just coach you through, getting through the next week or whatever it happens to be. So just think for you, what is your mechanism for pausing if you need to? Or terminating. So I've put pause on there. It might be appropriate that you terminate depending on what the client needs. So being just knowing in yourself, if this comes up, then this is what I will do. And then the other consideration is about signposting to other resources. So I mentioned about if it becomes clear that maybe therapy or counselling or something like that is more appropriate for the client. It's not for us to diagnose what the client needs. It might be clear that coaching or mentoring isn't necessarily the best fit right now, but unless we have the training or the professional capability of making another diagnosis, that's not for us to do. So there's a fine line between wanting to help the client and say, well, why don't you go and phone the therapist, or phone this person, or phone this organisation. Of course, as soon as we make any sort of suggestion, we've stepped out of coach and mentor mode, and we've kind of terminated that bit of the conversation anyway. So thinking about where might you signpost, or how might you handle that if the client says, who should I talk to? Just in any other sort of scenario where the client might ask, well, what do you think, or what would your advice be? Again, it's another request for advice, and how do we handle that as professionals? Depending on your niche, you may have some close links with some specific support agencies. So for example, the coaches that I've mentored who specialise in coaching post-divorce, they've got links in with family lawyers, and so if somebody comes to them and says, I'm about to divorce, or I'm going through a divorce and I need to speak to a solicitor, they might well signpost them to somebody where they've got that referral arrangement in place. I know some coaches who specialise in very niche areas who've got links with support agencies, specialist agencies, or local therapists or counsellors in particular niches. And if you're upfront about that, and you know that there's those cross-referral relationships in place, and your clients are aware that you have these links in with specialist organisations, and the client says, please can you put me in touch with this person, then that may be appropriate. But at the same time, it's that word of caution, that sort of little warning flag to just be aware that we are not there in the same way. We're not there to delve and dig into the disclosure or diagnose what's going on for the client. We're not there necessarily to recommend directing to other resources. That said, sorry, I've got slides down in front of my screen. And we will come back to that sort of signposting and extra resources in a little moment. The other thing that you might need to just be mindful of is which organisations might you be required to speak to, or might you want to choose to speak to. So even if you're not necessarily going to be intervening and assisting your client, if it's something that's come up and you weren't quite sure the best way to handle it. You might choose to go and speak to a professional organisation in that area just to find out from them a little bit more about the situation, or if it's likely to come up again, how would that organisation recommend you handle it. So if you're specialising in a niche with alcohol dependency, for example, you might want to go and find out more about what's going on for clients, just so you're more familiar with their context. But again, it's making sure that we are careful about not stepping into a space where we start becoming a sort of an authority on that subject area. But just being aware that if we are part of if somebody's made a disclosure and we're part of that follow-up process, then we might be called upon to speak to the police. Depending on what it is, we might be called to speak to a particular religious organisation, or in the UK we've got the child and adult social care arrangements. There are specialist care agencies, survivors groups. So depending on what has come up for the client, it may be appropriate, or we may be called upon to speak to any of these organisations. And of course, being an international body, we need to recognise that there will be local laws, local considerations in other territories. So depending on where you are based, you might want to investigate the safeguarding requirements, rules, regulations, and so on in your particular location. The other thing that I mentioned was about sort of creating a safe space for the client. These are some thoughts about creating a safe space for you as well as the client. So some practicalities from a safeguarding point of view for you, from a self-protection point of view. So this is one of the things, this is another of the light bulbs that went on when I was doing the formal safeguarding training, was lone working. So protecting yourself against allegations, or the risk of allegations. If you've got a vulnerable client, so imagine the scenario, you've been working with a one-to-one session, perhaps there's a gentleman who's very upset because he's just been bereaved, he's just lost his wife, he's been very upset, and your natural instincts, because you're a caring person, is to give that client a hug. And as they go to leave the meeting, it's been lovely to meet you, give them a hug. You misread the signals, and later on there's an allegation of inappropriate behaviour, inappropriate contact, shall we say. This aspect of safeguarding is making sure that you are protected from any potential allegations of misconduct. So I'm sure as professionals who take your responsibilities very seriously, you will make sure that you minimise any potential for those things. But it's useful to be aware of. So things like, if you are lone working, if you are working one-to-one with a client, where is that meeting taking place? So are you safe? Do you have an exit route? Do you feel vulnerable? Thinking back to the director I mentioned, the bullying allegation, as it became clear some of the other behaviour that this director had exhibited towards different members of that organisation, I did not feel comfortable being alone in a one-to-one session with that individual. So we made sure that I was meeting in a meeting room. It was still closed doors, private meeting, but we kept all the blinds open so that other people in the organisation could see the conversation. So that put a bit of protection in place for me, so I felt safer. The exit route, so do you know that you can leave safely should it arise, particularly if it's a new first meeting with a client and you don't know anything about this individual. You just want to make sure that you are safe and that they are safe. But also things like confidentiality, and if something is going to come up, if the client makes a disclosure, if you happen to be meeting in a coffee shop or in the foyer of a hotel back in the days when, in the pre-COVID days when we could meet in person, and hopefully it won't be that long before we can meet in person again. But think about the location of where is your coaching or mentoring taking place. Is it an appropriate venue for the disclosures that might be made, or for the sessions that you're going to be discussing, or the confidentiality you want to maintain? And thinking about your safety, particularly if you're lone working, who else knows where you are? Who else is in the vicinity? Are there people around who are, so you feel safe? There's nothing, if something does take an unexpected turn, are there people you could call on should you need to? And again, knowing where you are, if you are meeting a client for the first time and it's a one-to-one, I very, very, very rarely do I meet a client at their home. And certainly if it's at their home, I do not feel comfortable if it's a one-to-one private meeting and it's just one person at their house. That's just my personal vulnerability. I prefer to meet on neutral territory where I've got some control over the location and the situation that we're in. But if I'm going to go and meet somebody, I make sure that somebody knows who I'm, so I've told somebody where I'm going to meet, the timing, the location, who it is I'm meeting. I'll make sure that my phone has got charge. I'll hopefully have some signal, so should I need to call someone, I can. And my phone's got a tracking app. There's various ones that will track the location of the phone, so my other half can see where my phone is whenever it's switched on. So should anything untoward happen with a new client, and should I not turn up at home at the expected time, at least I can be tracked on my phone. So hopefully these things are so unlikely to happen that this is never going to be a concern for you. You will work with wonderful clients who are all lovely, and this will never be an issue for you. But as I say, we just don't know what's going on for people. We don't know what their stuff is. We don't know. This is kind of the belt and braces of best practice. And if in doubt, reschedule. So if anything feels uncomfortable for you as the service provider, then it's okay to say, you know what, I know you want me to come and meet at your house because you've got no childcare or something, you can't leave the home. I prefer not to meet at people's homes. It's just a safeguarding consideration. It's just my policy. So let's reschedule to a time where we can meet at the meeting room. So it's okay to say that you want to put safeguarding in place. It goes back to my the potential for allegations. This is probably I'm going to make a generalisation, possibly more for the gentlemen providing services to the ladies. That way round, maybe a higher risk than ladies providing services to the gentlemen in their homes. It may be that way round, might be more of a consideration. But also if there are children present, going back to the requirements of safeguarding children. If you're at a client's house and the client leaves the room to go and make a cup of coffee and their child is left in the room with you, if the child then says something, oh, mummy didn't like the way that person looked at me, suddenly you're into a whole can of worms, and for me it's just not worth the risk. So that was my personal choice. And the other thing is sometimes it's appropriate to record the session, the mentoring or coaching session. So either just audio or video. So in current times where we're meeting on Zoom meetings, it's really easy to just hit record. You might be choosing to do that from a safeguarding point of view if you've got any little concerns or worries, but actually just in general, offering it to the client to say as an added value, how about we record the session so you can refer back to them later on. And some clients really like that as an added value. It allows you to charge a premium on your fees because you're giving them a recording of your sessions as well. So that's something that you might be doing from a safeguarding point of view, but you can market it as an added value option for the clients. So that's quite a lot of consideration, quite a lot of things to think of. I'm fairly sure that, like me, the first time I came across this a few years ago, it was a bit of a light bulb moment, thinking, you know what, I've never given that any consideration before, but now I know about it, now I'm aware of it. I want to have a few things in place to think about. How would I handle these things? What would I put in place? So I'm going to invite you to just have a think now. What is your safeguarding action plan? So before we talk about resources and next steps, just for you, what might your action plan include? What sorts of considerations do you want to build in? What sort of action do you want to take as a next step? We've got a couple of minutes and then we'll come to a Q&A. So I'll stop the recording. We'll come to a Q&A for any specifics. But just have a think about that safeguarding. And just while people are doing that, David, do you want to pick up on some of what we've just been talking about?
I think everything that you've covered there, Nikki, so is sort of well in depth, and I think it was some years ago, the lone working issues all started to come out, and certainly if you work for an authority and you're a lone worker, so when you arrive at a client's house, then you ring to say you've arrived, and then you ring to say that you're back in the car and leaving to go somewhere else. Similar to yourself, I never actually go to a client's house, and I would never invite a client to mine. We either meet remotely through Zoom or Skype or telephone, or we meet in a public place, or I'm on the client's premises. And I believe that that is the personally, so like that is, the way that I prefer to operate. I know that I have some colleagues who are counsellors, and they will have clients come to their premises, but that comes with with its own ramifications and additional things that they have to make people aware of. And also they, without diverting and stuff like that, as soon as you've got people visiting your home, your insurance changes. As soon as you've got people visiting your home, you have to do risk assessments, so health and safety changes. And trying to put a marginally humorous slant on it, but the last thing that you want is somebody visits your home for a coaching session and your dog bites them, and they then have a very good coaching session, they leave, and then you get sued because they've been bitten by your dog. And for me personally, it's just not worth going through that, through the risk. I think as well the the where things are taking place, again, it's thinking about what will the client prefer, because if you've got somebody who is feeling a little bit vulnerable, they might not want to be, I'm thinking about I almost said back in the day then, it was only a few months ago, but when you could meet in coffee shops, they might not want to talk about something that's sensitive, with a lot of people around. So it depends upon what the topic is, but certainly everything that you've gone through there, you have to protect yourself. And an expression that I'm very fond of is what people tell you when you're on an airline, which is put your own oxygen mask on first, because if you don't do that, you can't help anyone else beyond that.
Yeah. And actually, that bit about that list of vulnerable persons, if you temporarily fall into that category, so for example, bereavement being an obvious one, if you have become a vulnerable person, then just think about how you self-manage that, and whether that's got an implication as well for your work as a client. David, I think one of the questions that people might be thinking is where, if I want to learn more about this, what might be some of the sources? Do you want to touch on where people might go for a bit of CPD, or a bit of where they might take this learning further?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of information on the internet, around safeguarding. The NSPCC, certainly for people who work within the school environment, or work with children, or as they call it, young adults under the age of, have their own training. And it depends, like everything else, how much depth you want to go into. I think personally, everybody should have at least an overview about what safeguarding is. The ones that are here, from Udemy down to CPD Online, they were just the ones that that offer online training courses, a variety of different options between working with children, working with vulnerable adults, a general overview. They're not endorsed by the IAPC&M. They are literally, I can't lie, they are literally just the ones that I found had more than one option on the internet. And like all online courses, it's really a case of exploring it a little bit, finding out what it covers, what you get out of it. And I think that if safeguarding is going to be a key area of the work that you do, then you might want to take that further. You might want to attend a more in-depth program. It's we can't give you the what you should do and what you shouldn't do. That is very much about reflecting yourself on who you work with and how much information that you need to know. There are a number of leaflets, again, going back to the NSPCC and a number of their child lines, which is a sort of a branch. They all have a lot of information online of what you should do, what you shouldn't do. They have some very good phraseology as well around when you're working with people who might be vulnerable, around not necessarily using what I would call the sort of academic, professional language, and having that sort of rapport with people to say, look, it would be great you know, like if we could keep everything confidential, but you know, one of the things that we need to do is to ensure that you're safe and that you're well. And yeah, as a result of that, there are going to be some things that I have to tell somebody else, you know, like for everybody's benefit. But I assure you that if I'm going to do that, then, you know, I'll be talking it through, you know, like with you first about when that'll happen, how it'll happen, you know, and you're like, and whether you want to be involved in it. And I think so, like the whole process, you know, like of that is, you know, remembering that you've still got to, you know, whether the person is vulnerable or not, you've still got a relationship with them. So the courses here, so like are very much the sort of, you know, this is what you need to be aware of. This is, you know, how you need to do it. Having had a quick flick through, so like most of these, they were, you know, so like they range in price from free to, you know, like 20 or 30 pounds for a couple of hours, so like worth of, you know, like online learning. And I think so like from there you just need to decide, you know, whether you want to do it or whether you don't. So like that's what it.
Yeah. In terms of accreditation, so if somebody wants to get in touch and ask a question about how they might investigate safeguarding in the context of accreditation, whether they want some pointers or some help, then I would suggest that for the first instance, maybe giving a shout to David or Dawn for pointers or some extra help. So if you do, having watched this, if something's come up for you, or if you want some guidance in terms of from a sort of supervision session, if you've had some challenges with a client who's maybe disclosed something and you're not sure how best to handle a client disclosure or something like that, if there's anything that comes up that's concerning you with relation to your accreditation or how best to handle this going forward, then please do get in touch and ask the question, even if it's a case that we just point you in a direction of somebody who can help you, but do get in touch. I'm conscious that we said we would keep to an hour, and we are exactly on an hour, so I'm going to stop the recording. Thank you ever so much for your attention, for being here in this session. I hope that it has given food for thought, and that you will now decide what your safeguarding action plan is. What are your next steps? What do you want to do now with this information? And as I say, do get in touch if you need to.